ever wondered, really wondered? Before the grand tapestries of history were woven, before humans were building pyramids that scraped the sky, inventing smartphones that held the world in our palms, or writing self-help books about waking up to your full potential. What were we? Not quite the modern humans you see in the mirror. Not exactly monkeys either. Something in between. Something awkward and lost, stumbling through primeval jungles and open savannas, half curious, half confused. They couldn't speak in eloquent sentences. They couldn't paint masterpieces on cave walls. They didn't have TikTok to distract them or caffeine to fuel them. But they left the first, deep, irrevocable footprints on the long road that leads directly to us. These were the ape men, the hominins, and today we're going to pull back the curtain of time and talk about the 5 things no one ever really told you about them. First truth, our ancient cousins weren't monkeys, but they weren't fully human either. They were a rough draft, a free demo of what humanity would one day become. Think about writing your first novel. It's awkward, messy, full of weird metaphors and plot holes, but somewhere in that chaos, there's a spark of potential. That's who they were. Creatures like Australopithecus afarensis, the species of the famous fossil Lucy, were a breathtaking paradox. They walked on 2 legs, a revolutionary act that freed their hands to explore, to carry, to create. Imagine them striding across the East African plains 3.5 million years ago. Their gait wasn't our smooth, efficient stride. It was likely a bit more wobbly, a bit more hesitant. But they were upright. They could scan the horizon for predators, the terrifying saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas that prowled their world. Their eyes, alert and cautious, were taking in the world from a new perspective. And yet, from the neck up, they were still profoundly ape-like. Their brains were tiny, only about 450 cubic centimeters, not much bigger than a chimpanzee's and a mere third of the size of ours. They had projecting jaws and no sign of a forehead. If you met one on a quiet street today, you wouldn't know whether to wave or run. Too smart to be just a beast. Not quite human enough to call kin. But make no mistake. Without this clumsy, brilliant walking contradiction, you and I simply wouldn't be here. They were the brave ones who took the first, uncertain step away from the trees and into a new destiny. And then, one day, by accident or by a flicker of pure inspiration, one of them picked up a rock and smashed it against another. Not out of boredom, not for fun, but because somewhere, deep inside that small but growing brain, a question sparked. Maybe this can help me survive. That moment, that single percussive crack, sparked a quiet revolution. Here's the second truth. These early ancestors were using tools long before anyone gave them credit. For decades, we thought the first toolmaker was Homo habilis, the handyman, but science is a story that's constantly being rewritten. At a windswept dig site in Kenya called Lomekwi 3, scientists uncovered a collection of stone tools dated back to an astonishing 3.3 million years ago. The problem? That's 700,000 years before the first known Homo habilis even existed. So who made them? All signs point to an earlier group, very likely an Australopithecus species, Lucy and her gang. And these weren't elegant, teardrop-shaped hand axes. No, these first tools were crude, chunky, and opportunistic. They were heavy rocks used as hammers and sharp-edged flakes broken off a coarse stone. They weren't shaping flint for fashion. They were engineers of the everyday. They were cracking open the bones of scavenged carcasses to get to the rich, fatty marrow inside. A superfood that would have been a massive caloric boost for their developing brains. They were prying nutrient-rich roots from the hard-baked earth. They were throwing rocks at anything that might want to eat them. They didn't have names for their tools, the hammerstone, the flake, but they understood their purpose. All it took was one bold hit, and evolution blinked awake. But don't think for a second that this is a clean, linear story of one lonely species clawing its way to glory. Nope. The past was much messier, and far more interesting. And that brings us to the third truth. There wasn't just one type of early human. At some point, the world was like a bizarre, sprawling family reunion, but no one remembered how they were related. Fast forward to about 300,000 years ago. Earth was a hominin melting pot. In Africa, our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, were just starting out, tinkering with more sophisticated tools and perhaps the first sparks of symbolic art. But they weren't alone. Over in Europe and the Middle East, the Neanderthals were thriving. Forget the brutish caveman stereotype. These were highly intelligent and adapted survivors. They were stocky, immensely strong, had brains larger than ours, and were apex predators who hunted massive prey like mammoths and woolly rhinos in organized groups. They were possibly the original rock musicians in a literal sense, and there's evidence they used pigments and wore eagle talons as jewelry. Meanwhile, on the island of Flores in Indonesia, a truly fantastical chapter of the human story was unfolding. Here lived Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit. This was a species of hominin that stood barely 3 feet tall with a tiny brain, yet they hunted pygmy elephants and lived in caves. They were a testament to evolution's incredible creativity, a human lineage shaped by the strange rules of island life. And then, in a cave in Siberia, a single pinky bone and a tooth revealed a whole new branch of the family tree, the Denisovans. These are our ghost cousins. We know so little about them, yet we know from our own DNA that our ancestors met them, and, well, got to know them quite well. Many modern humans, especially in Asia and Oceania, carry a sliver of Denisovan DNA within them. The world wasn't a one-human show. It was a wild, crowded, global experiment in what human could mean. For a time, you could have walked from Africa to Asia and met at least 4 or 5 different kinds of humans. But in the end, after tens of thousands of years of coexistence, only one of us made it. Why? Was it our superior smarts? Our more complex language? Our boundless imagination? Or maybe we just got lucky? Which brings us to the fourth, and possibly most touching truth of all. They cared for each other. In the brutal, unforgiving world they inhabited, this might be the most surprising discovery. We often think of prehistoric life through the cold lens of survival of the fittest. A constant, merciless battle where only the strong prevail. But the bones tell a different story, a more human story. Scientists have found numerous skeletons of early hominins who suffered devastating injuries but lived for years afterward. In Dmanisi, Georgia, they found the 1.8-million-year-old skull of a Homo erectus individual who had lost all but one of their teeth long before they died. This person would have been unable to chew tough meat or fibrous plants. How did they survive? The only possible answer: someone else in their group was feeding them, perhaps by finding soft foods or even pre-chewing their meals. Even more powerfully, at a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists found the remains of a Neanderthal, Shanidar I, who had lived a life of extreme hardship. He had a crushing blow to his head that would have blinded him in one eye, a withered and likely useless right arm, and severe arthritis in his legs. He was, by all accounts, disabled. Yet he lived to be around 40 years old, a ripe old age for his time. He couldn't have hunted. He couldn't have fought. He survived because his clan protected him, fed him, cared for him. In a world full of predators and the constant threat of starvation, that kind of behavior isn't just a biological anomaly. It's the beginning of us. There were no hospitals, no medicine, no Instagram reels with the caption, "Be kind." But these creatures, our distant relatives, still chose not to leave the weak and the injured behind. That's not survival of the fittest. That's compassion before language. That's humanity before Homo sapiens. But wait, there's one more secret, and it might be the most mysterious of all. The fifth truth. They might have buried their dead. This is a profound one. For a long time, the act of intentionally disposing of the dead, a ritual, was seen as the exclusive domain of modern humans. It implies abstract thought, a sense of loss, and maybe even a belief in an afterlife. Then, deep within the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, a team of daring paleoanthropologists wriggled through a passage so narrow it's called the Superman's Crawl to enter a chamber no modern human had ever seen. What they found there changed everything. On the floor of this deep, dark, incredibly difficult-to-reach chamber lay the scattered remains of at least 15 individuals of a newly discovered species, Homo naledi. There was no sign of a predator attack. No evidence of a rockfall or a flood that washed them in. The skeletons were laid out purposefully. This wasn't chaos, it was intention. And the species? Homonality had a brain no bigger than a grapefruit. Yet, this species with a primitive small brain may have performed the earliest funerals. No religion, no priest, no spoken eulogies. Just the silent, powerful idea. This life mattered. Let's mark its end with care. Let's place them somewhere special. Somewhere separate from the world of the living. That's not just instinct. That's the search for meaning. That's the spark of something sacred. Now, let's imagine for a moment. You step out of a time machine, the air hitting your face, smelling of dust and wild, unfamiliar leaves. The place is East Africa. The time is 2.5 million years ago. Ahead, a small, hairy figure with deep, curious eyes approaches. It doesn't scream. It doesn't attack. It pauses, glances at your strange shoes, sniffs the air, and then quietly places a sharpened stone at your feet, as if to say, I cracked this rock first. What have you done lately? This isn't a creature simply waiting to evolve. This is a pioneer, a silent inventor, the first in a long, unbroken chain of makers, dreamers, and survivors. And you, standing there in your smart jacket with your smartwatch blinking, suddenly feel small, humbled, maybe even a little bit grateful. We used to look back and laugh at crude cave drawings or chipped stones. But imagine being a creature who just learned to walk upright, with no maps, no elders explaining how to thrive in the wild in 10 easy steps. And yet you find a way. You find a way to live, to hunt, to adapt, to care for your own. You're not primitive. You're an uncredited genius. The truth is, despite the thousands of generations that separate us, there's still a bit of them in every single one of us. Every time you crave a break from the concrete city and yearn for the mountains or the sea, that's your ancient evolutionary wiring whispering. Every time you look up at the stars on a clear night and wonder, is someone else out there? You're echoing the silent, overwhelming awe they must have felt as they gazed at the exact same sky. They didn't have language, but they had eye contact. They didn't have gods, but they feared the dark. They didn't have philosophy, but they stayed with the injured. They didn't have religion, but they may have laid the first stone on a loved one's final resting place. In an age where we pride ourselves on being so advanced, maybe the most important lesson they can teach us is humility. The profound realization that everything we boast about today, our smartphones, our space telescopes, our neural networks, rests on the small, unsure feet of those who first stood up and thought, I wonder what's over that hill. Their hands were clumsy. Their brains weren't wired for calculus. But somehow, against all odds, they figured out the most important thing of all. How to become a community. In the end, the story of the ape men isn't a tragedy of failed species and evolutionary dead ends. It's the unfinished symphony that became our opening act. Each rough, tentative rhythm they beat on the drum of time led to the complex, beautiful, and sometimes chaotic harmony of modern humanity. Without them, there is no us. And that is something worth remembering, not as a dry footnote in a textbook, but as a heartfelt tribute, a deep and abiding reverence for those who left no names, but carved the very first path, the one that led directly, miraculously, to us.